What I'm going to do is give you basically a kind of a quick summary of really the high-performance computing in the EU, progress on the implementation of their European HPC strategy, and really what this boils down to is basically this is more or less a summary of a recent IDC study that we undertook, where we were commissioned by the EU to assess the progress against their 2012 action plan, which was entitled High Performance Computing, Europe's Place in the Global Race. And one of the reasons that I think IDC was chosen to to assess that particular plan was because IDC, Earl Josephson, Steve Conway, and a couple of other of my predecessors were instrumental in actually doing the original study in 2010 that formed the basis of the 2012 action plan. So at a bare minimum, IDC was in the position of assessing the effectiveness of a program that it was instrumental in formulating. And when we get to the final, when we jump to the end, some of the conclusions that I'm going to be presenting to you about where we think the EU will be going in the future is because based on some of the findings of the study that we did here, those findings that IDC did will serve as the basis for how the EC goes forward in the next 5 to 10 years in their action plan. So we kind of have a certain degree of credibility within the EU and in their HPC promotion projects. So we're pretty confident that a lot of the recommendations that we made will be strongly considered by the EU going forward in their next action plan, which is due out at some point this year, 2015. I don't know what the current status is. They tend to run a little behind schedule at times, so we're looking to see that the announcement come out very shortly. But we did have the workshop in Brussels earlier in the summer, and got pretty wide receptive responses from most of the EU members that were there to hear the plan and hear the IDC recommendations. So we're very optimistic that the recommendations we made will ultimately find their way into the plan going forward. I just put this up here because you can go crazy trying to remember the acronyms. I wish they'd come up with some more because they all sound terribly the same. Ultimately, one of the first things we did on this task was we looked. They came up with what they considered in their action plan to be these 6 large action items that they've been working on since the plan went into action in 2012. And we really broke it down and looked at each of the 6 actions that they undertook. Came up with where we're going and kind of the IDC assessment. And the first action that was part of the plan was basically governance at the EU level. One of the big concerns in the early days of this program was that there was no sense of an EU cohesive HPC strategy or vision, that it was really continually the collection of the member states going off on their own directions, and that there wasn't a sense of unity or cohesion. And one of the big efforts of the action plan was to at least try to encourage a mentality of having an EU-centric strategic vision, and really to get the folks in the individual member states to think in a much more corporate EU-wide behavior. And really, one of the situations that existed then and still exists now is it is significantly more challenging to organize and collaboratively advance R&D in the EU than it is in basically single nation competitors such as the United States and Japan and China. There were some really awkward moments at times where folks who were in the committees in the EU would basically lament that they wished that they could deal with a government as effective and as fast-moving as the U.S. government, that they seriously envied our nimbleness in policy. Yeah, that tells you how complicated the system can be over there. But the bottom line is that we surveyed a number of experts in the EU as part of this assessment, and really the overwhelming response we got was the plan has definitely worked at one particular level, which is there is now a general sense that has never existed before of an EU-wide HPC mentality. That if nothing else, and regardless of the sense of demonstrable advances, there is certainly now a belief within the EU that they are moving forward in terms of a strong, comprehensive EU-wide HPC strategy. And the effort here is to build on those early successes, the kinds of things that have happened between 2012 and today that have created this aura of enthusiasm for a much wider, more comprehensive EU HPC policy. Some of the real advances we saw in terms of governance, as I said, there's an HPC consciousness. They have basically an EU-wide scheme for categorizing HPC centers. We heard lots of positive things about a single peer review process for accessing these tier 0 supercomputer centers, the really big ones that are kind of the pinnacle of the HPC world in Europe. And the general sense is that if you have a good project and you can basically make a strong case, you can get access to one of these tier 0 centers, even if you're not one of the major funding nations like Germany, like the UK, like France, or like Italy, that some of the other nations in the 28 EU member states have access to get to these tier 0 kinds of facilities if they have a relatively progressive research project. That was a real another step forward. And then overwhelming response in terms of improved access from industry of all sizes. Europe is very concerned about bringing in the small and medium enterprise class into the HPC world. We saw lots of cases where really some of the major industrial players, and the automotive sector comes to mind, Mercedes-Benz kind of leading the way in terms of really thinking about of using HPCs effectively in their product development. And those industries are very, very interested in basically bringing HPC to their entire supply chain. And so there's lots and lots of interest of bringing in the large base of SMEs in the industrial sectors in the EU to basically allow them to participate more fully at the level of HPC capability that some of the larger industrial players do at any given time. If we looked at the financial envelope, which is basically, is the EU spending enough on these kinds of problems? And really what we found was that while they basically stuck to some of the recommendations of the early 2012 plan, we found that the way the money is chopped up, it doesn't always lead to the kinds of conclusions that or the kinds of outcomes that you'd really be interested in. There are certain rules about how much EU funding can be applied to a specific member state project. It can be tapped at 20%. There's concerns here that commitments were in-kind contributions for materials or equipment that ultimately were never used or picked up or appropriately applied to where they could do the best thing. The concern here is that based on their current funding levels and some of the limitations about how funding at the EU level can be driven into the member states, there really isn't a clear path to fund the kinds of developments and the kinds of costs that we think an exascale system can be developed in a competitive time frame vis-a-vis the United States and China and perhaps even Japan. And that funding issue, beyond just the absolute dollar values, but some of the conditions that exist that limit the way those dollars can be spent, that's an issue that needs to be addressed. One of the things is resource pooling is particularly problematic within the EU right now. It's one thing to get the EU funding to cooperate with member state fundings. That's hard. It's even harder when you want to have resource pooling across member nations. Very difficult to get, say, Germany and the UK or Germany and France to think about resource pooling at that level. That's another funding issue that creates some real impediments to progress. A public procurement of innovative systems and pre-competitive procurements, the kinds of things that are very typical here in the US and Japan, the idea of basically going out and funding research or going out and buying pre-competitive systems as a way to foster innovation, legitimize lines of research in the industrial sector. Those things are significantly underused within the EU, and that's something that we talked long and hard about because there are actually some significant legal impediments to making that happen as easily and as effectively as it does here in the US, and that's something that they're definitely going to be looking at. The bottom line here is that resource pooling among the member states is really going to be a necessary funding element if they want to have a competitive exascale development program in the same time frame that we see happening in the US and other HPC leadership nations. The supply chain issue is one that we found troubling to many, but most were perfectly willing to accept the fact that right now the EU is not really capable of producing the supply chain, the entire infrastructure, particularly in hardware, to build an HPC. And most recognize that it's not going to be cost effective to try to replicate semiconductor production capabilities, fostering companies that could actually assemble HPCs that would be competitive. So really we got the sense that while it may not be the best of all possible situations, not only was the EU cognizant of the fact that it's not cost effective to go out and build a redundant supply chain to build HPCs, but it's really more sophisticated to go out and pick best in class from the rest of the world. And not only pick it, but encourage EU people, EU organizations to go out and make sure that they have access to the best technology around the world. So from a hardware perspective, the general sense is we don't need a supply chain from a hardware perspective. It's a waste of money, it's not efficient, and it's something that they're really not going to be looking at terribly, terribly hard. Now that said, there are opportunities here, and the European Technology Program for HPC, the ETP for HPC, is a relatively well-funded industry consortium that is looking to build key technologies that can add to the exascale equation. Again, they're not trying to replicate indigenous capabilities. They're trying to really find places where they can use their indigenous skills and capabilities to add to the equation as opposed to just simply replicating it. And that particular program is one that a lot of people are very interested in following closely because it is the one that is most directly linked with the kind of industrial base, the technology development capabilities in the EU writ large. So we're watching that very carefully as well. Again, trying to drive HPC usage into their commercial sector. Unlike the US, they don't have the large military agenda that can drive lots of HPC development within the private sector. And so they are really much more cognizant of the fact that if their HPC success will depend largely on its ability to have a vibrant industrial sector that uses HPCs, that can kind of depend on HPCs to drive their global economic competitiveness. And so they're really looking to expand industrial use in a big way and kind of grappling with some of the ways to make that happen. Again, I can't stress enough the idea that they're really interested in looking at the SME perspective here, trying to bring in the folks that normally can't afford HPCs, haven't really thought about them, and perhaps don't even know the potential advantages they're missing by using HPCs in their design or R&D cycle. And that's a key element in what playing field. The idea that Europe is one of the countries that, you know, they want to be able to access the best machines in the world. They want to have the ability to market around the world, and they're just generally concerned, are there impediments towards global trade that puts Europe at a disadvantage? And they're thinking about this, but to be quite honest with you, we basically decided that this was something that was more addressable at the government level as a policy activity, as opposed to something that the HPC community should be looking at in a definitely targeted way. We presented to them a kind of the big picture of where they stood, and then based on those analysis, we basically gave them the recommendations for going forward. And again, the point here is that these recommendations were relatively widely accepted by the EU folks, and we expect to see a number of the things that we recommended going into the action plan and driving the European programs forward, at least for the next 5 to 7 years. It's kind of the simple, straightforward one, which was expand funding for HPC. And really, the key here, though, is, you know, continue to fund, thinking about $1 to $1.2 billion, or 1 to 1.2 billion euros a year, kind of funding for this kind of thing. But the additional point that we made was the idea of coming up with two different lines of evolution when it came to exascale systems, and the first one would be kind of a pre-exascale system in the 2019 to 2020, and then basically an exascale system in 2022, but on two different tracks. The first track would be the low-risk track, where you're basically looking at proven technology. You're looking at the technology that's available to build a low-risk HPC that can most likely deliver the kind of performance that will allow people to gain access to an indigenous European exascale system. The other one, which was much higher risk, which would stress technologies from European suppliers. And one of the reasons that we thought this was an important issue is because it's just really important for people out there who are thinking about exascale technologies to participate in the activity of trying to build a system. And that would really kind of hone and help them decide how to array priorities and such. And so the idea of building a high-risk system that was somewhat emphasized European skills was something that we thought would be very valuable for their efforts going forward. Again, the funding, member states need to pool their resources with each other. There's no clear path. This is not going to happen if they were looking at 2020, and bottom line is we just basically said, you know, if you're thinking about a real exascale system, you may want to look at 2022. And it's interesting because the first thing that we came up with, as soon as we took a break, people came up and said, well, we want to think about the dollar value of coming up with an exascale system in 2022, because if we can afford one in 2022, if we wait 12 months, can we afford two at the same price? And if we wait 18 months, can we afford four? And so they were immediately thinking about the time dollar value of when they produce some of their exascale systems. So while 2022 may be the earliest part, there's going to be some discussion about the trade-offs in terms of how many systems they can build if they wait a certain amount of time and don't have to be at the cutting edge, but if they can wait 12 months or 24 months to gain some economies of scale, to basically benefit from the pathfinding efforts of other. The funding resource pooling stuff, again, I can't stress that enough. And basically the ETP for HPC through PRACE, which is one of their other overarching government-funded programs for HPC development, coordination between technology roadmaps and user requirements. That's kind of a critical element here to make sure that the program moves forward in a way that matches user requirements and matches the kinds of technology projections that the EU is thinking about. It's an old story. Make sure that government doesn't either outpace or lag behind the kinds of technology trends where the commercial and international sectors are going. In the EU about HPC, that none of them could clearly figure out exactly what was going on in the EU. There's lots of different programs. They all have relatively interesting names and relatively confusing acronyms. And we heard lots of great stories about, here's my example of something that's interesting. But when we asked them about impressions of the comprehensive plan, there was this kind of, well, gee, I really don't know what's going on. And we felt that there was a real place here to not only make it easy and accessible to understand the comprehensive plan, but also to make it more lively. The EU, when they post progress reports and what's up, it tends to have a significant time lag, and the links are all functionally dead. You could never get to a human being if your life depended on it. And we told them you need to make this a much more live and actionable kind of portal, and also put some people on board, so you can actually have human beings that are responsible for answering questions from folks as they're trying to figure out how they can weigh in onto the EU efforts. Building on something that came out of one of our original studies, which is that the EU, if you look at some of the larger HPC centers, the EU is doing rather well when it comes to software development for large systems. If you survey any individual site, they'll tell you that some of their most important applications codes were developed in-house, or at least certainly within the EU. And we heard that time and time again. But if you dig a little deeper, you find out that of all those codes, they only exist in 1 or 2 or 3 different places. So you have these very isolated pockets of excellence where there's almost no synergy, and where those codes don't really see the light of day in any great place. And we said, this is the kind of opportunity for you to really think about taking the expertise you have in applications development and subject matter expertise, and translating that into HPC usage and making that available to a wider audience. It shouldn't be a situation where you have world-class software that 1 or 2 sites in Europe is actually getting access to. It's really time to start thinking. In-class repository where anyone that's interested can see the kind of really good code that's being developed in the EU and take advantage of it and build on it. And access it. The last couple slides I want to go over here before I choke to death is some of the things that actually weren't in the study, and we basically said, hey, here's some things you really need to be thinking about. The first one is, if you look at their HPC plan right now, there was really no discussion on high-performance data analytics, which in retrospect seems kind of strange, and as soon as it was mentioned, we all kind of said, wow, this is strange and something that needs to be addressed. So really, we're going to be looking for at least the standing up of one center of excellence for HPDA. We don't know how it's going to be organized, but there certainly will be additional efforts spent in their overall HPC strategic plan to look at high-performance data analysis. Within these programs to deal with cloud computing, and that's something that, based on our discussions, we think we're going to see a lot more activity from the government level on cloud computing. And I think I just hit 0, and I've gotten to questions, and that's about it. But as I said, it was a really interesting and eye-opening experience just to see some of the trials and tribulations that happen when you have to work in a much more collaborative environment than the one that I think we're used to. We got a little hint of it today, but at least everyone here was working for the same government. Imagine when you have 28 different governments, the amount of complexities there goes up by a factorial. So I wish them luck. They have a long road to go, but they're certainly, at least I think, taking the right steps to go down the right road. That's it. Any questions of sorts?
Hey, Bob, I'm curious that they allowed you to brief this. If you're doing a study for the EU, it has a lot of competitiveness implications, and if they're letting IDC share that?
I mean, as far as they're concerned, this is going to be their plan, and it won't be any secret. And as I said, they are very interested in collaboration and making sure that, you know, this is not a circling the wagons activity. This is, in some sense, this is an acknowledgement that the EU has some really good things to offer, but where they can't offer the best, it's time to go out. And we saw an interesting definition where they would talk about funding research and development, and it had to be EU-based. But what that meant was it could be anybody doing research as long as it was based in the EU. So when Lenovo sets up an R&D center in the EU, that becomes an EU-based R&D activity. It may be coming from a Chinese company, but it's something that it's at least physically based there. So they're casting a pretty wide net in that sense. So I think that the availability of this, of the analysis and the plans going forward is just a reflection of the fact that they understand that this has to be open, it has to be discussed, and it can't build this kind of fortress EU mentality to that extent. So again, I applaud them for that kind of sophistication. By the way, the lesson learned here is never have the popcorn at the break before you're about to speak.
Hey Bob, Pete Hobson from Isotope. I was at your talk in Brussels. I spoke earlier a bit about the Horizon 2020 project that we're part of. I'm aware there's a lot more going on in Horizon 2020 in terms of funding towards exascale outside of the ET4 HPC. What's your general take on what's going on with Horizon 2020 and Europe's progress, and also in terms of the projects coming out of ET4 HPC and how that maps up to the US and the rest of the world?
I mean, to me, again, it's not an issue. It's just I note that there are lots and lots of programs over there, and I wonder if they could benefit perhaps by a little more coordinated activity. You know, you look at SHAPE, you look at Fortissimo. There's lots, like I said, lots and lots of interesting programs out there, and it's very difficult to see how they all connect. And I know Horizon 2020 is this kind of umbrella kind of program that has HPC as just one aspect to it, but my concern here is if they are all rationalized and if there's not a duplication of effort, or if there's not something that may be a more comprehensive perspective on these things couldn't help out. But I love the sense of activity and the sense of vitality, and the fact that this is all relatively open to embracing. There's lots of work going on, and everybody seems to be free to open up and basically say, here's what we want to do. Here's how we want to add to the base of knowledge. So I think, and what's interesting here, and I think I said this at the at the workshop that we were at, is that while there are complexities with dealing with 28 nations, if they can solve those problems, the incredible diversity of capabilities and skills that 28 different nations can bring to bear on a significant problem, if they can work out some of the difficulties, that is an incredible source of innovation that a single nation can't really hope to match easily. So I look at that as kind of a double-edged sword. Yes, coordination is difficult, but by the same time, if you can get it right, you can really come up with some innovative solutions that you wouldn't expect to see from, U.S. has a single nation mentality, or single government mentality, but we also have a relatively vibrant, innovative industrial sector. You contrast that with, say, a central planned government and a central planned S&T environment like what you'd see in China today. That's at the other end of the spectrum. And so I think that there's lots and lots of potential for lots and lots of great ideas, 1,000 flowers blooming in the EU, that presents them with a unique opportunity to move forward.